Captain Frederick John Burke was known as a heavy weather captain. He was one of the grizzled old-timers who trusted their ship more than any weather forecast. One of those who understood that it was their job to deliver their cargo no matter what the lakes threw at them. In 1940, life on the lakes had changed very little since the large steel freighters were introduced more than half a century before. These ships were simple and efficient. While their faults were well known, they were frequently pushed to their limits. But men like Captain Burke knew what their ships could handle. That's why Captain Burke's actions on the night of May 1st, 1940 baffles historians to this day. As an unexpected gale overtook Lake Superior, he sailed through the open lake, leaving his ship vulnerable to the storm. Despite questioning from his crew who knew that they were headed for disaster, Captain Burke, seemingly in some kind of trance, refused to change course. When his ship finally succumbed to the elements, and his crew fled to the lifeboats, Captain Burke remained on board as his ship surrendered to Lake Superior. The wreck of the Arlington was finally discovered not long before the making of this video. But the mystery of why Captain Burke went down with his ship endures. This is the strange story of the SS Arlington. The SS Arlington left the Horn elevator dock at Port Arthur, Ontario on April 30th, 1940, carrying 98,000 bushels of wheat. She sailed for the Great Lakes Elevator in Owen Sound on Georgian Bay. It was early in the 1940 season, and the Arlington recently passed inspection, demonstrating that while she was going on 30 years of service, she was perfectly seaworthy. The Arlington was constructed at the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte, Michigan. Designated hull number 192, she was launched with the name F.P. Jones in 1913. She was a typical canaler, designed to navigate the narrow St. Lawrence River locks. She measured 244 feet, or 74.4 meters in length, with a beam of 43 feet, or 13 meters. She was powered by a coal-fired triple expansion steam engine that could achieve a top speed of around 10 knots. She was sold to new owners in 1919 and renamed the Glencadam. She enjoyed a relatively uneventful career for the next few years, proving herself a capable and reliable vessel. In 1925, she was purchased by the Matthews Steamship Company and renamed the Arlington. A decade later, she was sold one last time to the Burke Towing and Salvage Company. The Canadian shipping company, owned by Captain Dave Burke and his brother Edward Burke, operated a modest fleet consisting of a few barges and a tug. The Arlington was an ambitious step toward expanding their business. She was commanded by Captain Roderick Graham, a well-respected veteran who was nearing the end of his career on the lakes. When he announced that the 1939 season would be his last, Dave and Edward Burke turned to their brother, Captain Frederick John Burke. The two brothers had long sought to bring their brother into the business, but Captain Burke was going on 25 years with the Playfair fleet. Loyal to his longtime employer, Burke wasn't exactly keen to join his brothers. But when Captain Graham retired, he relented, taking command of the Arlington at the start of the 1940 season. When she left Port Arthur in April of 1940, a large freighter called the Collingwood departed at almost the same time. They anticipated normal weather for the voyage. Cold and overcast, with north to northeast winds, and some light snow. But as the two freighters crossed Thunder Bay and sailed into Lake Superior, the clouds overhead darkened and the winds picked up. At first, the Collingwood sailed comfortably ahead of the Arlington, but not long after the two ships passed Trowbridge Island Light, Captain Thomas J. Carson of the Collingwood reduced his speed and allowed the smaller steamer to take the lead, as they were soon enveloped in snow and fog. While the Collingwood was larger and faster, the Arlington was equipped with a direction finder. Rather than sailing blind, Captain Carson could follow Captain Burke with reasonable confidence they wouldn't get lost in the building storm. But his confidence in his fellow captain would soon prove to be misplaced. Captain Frederick John Burke was born in Midland, Ontario on June 12, 1885. As a child, he struggled with a severe speech impediment that left him unable to pronounce the nickname his family had given him, Teddy. When he tried to say his name, Tatey Bug, it came out as Tatey Bug. The mispronounced name stuck, and eventually it became a nickname that he was proud of. Tatey Bug Burke was known for his big personality and uneven disposition. He was rough-talking, erratic, and impulsive, but he was also generous with his crew, and he was known to run a happy ship. While he had a reputation for risk-taking and was often referred to as a heavy-weather captain, his navigation skills were top-notch. In 1940, there was no reason to doubt that Captain Burke would make an excellent master for the Arlington. Joining him for the first time on this voyage was first mate Junius Maxey. With 32 years on the lakes, Maxey had the experience to serve as a captain himself. He was on watch that afternoon as the Arlington left Thunder Bay and entered Lake Superior. As the sky grew darker and the wind and waves swelled, it became clear that the weather reports were wrong. When fully loaded, the Arlington had only 3.5 feet of freeboard, the distance between the waterline and her deck. Maxey knew that this would make them vulnerable to even moderate swells if they weren't careful, and he prudently ordered a course change hugging Lake Superior's north shore. While this would add additional time to the voyage, the shoreline would offer valuable protection from the north and northeast winds. It was a logical order that any experienced lake captain would also make. But just as the wheelsman began turning the ship north, Captain Burke stepped into the pilot house. While he was known to be well liked by his crew, this was the first time most of these men had served under him. There were no pleasantries. Captain Burke observed the course change and immediately contradicted the order, telling the wheelsmen to instead sail directly for Whitefish Point, a course that would take them through the middle of Lake Superior, leaving them exposed to the worst that the building gale could throw at them. Flabbergasted, Maxey responded, "You just think you're going to Whitefish?" But to this, the captain simply muttered something incoherent and then shuffled out, returning to his cabin where he would remain for most of the night. As darkness fell, the sea state continued to worsen, with swell after swell breaking over the deck of the Arlington, battering at her hatch covers. Second mate Arthur Ferris inspected the hatches at 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. and found them in good shape. Both times he reported his findings to the captain, who remained held up in his cabin, and both times the captain barely muttered any real response. While the captain didn't seem too concerned with the growing storm, there was an uneasy sense among the crew that they were needlessly sailing into an increasingly dangerous situation. But for the moment, no one dared to challenge the captain's authority, and the Arlington continued. The Collingwood followed, running about 10 minutes behind. By 10 p.m., the wind had reached gale force, and even though she had significantly more freeboard, Captain Carson was concerned to see waves occasionally wash over the decks of the Collingwood. At 12:30, he ordered his speed reduced and settled in for a long and trying night. First mate Maxey arrived in the pilot house for his watch at 12:15 that night, anxiously aware that his captain, who remained holed up in his cabin, had steered them into the heart of an unrelenting gale. While the hatch covers had been properly secured before they left, Maxey watched with concern as every wave washed over the deck, pummeling the tightly covered openings. By now, the sea and their current heading made it too dangerous to send anyone out to inspect them. Any breach could prove deadly, and it was critical to protect the hatches as much as possible and detect any damage as quickly as they could. The Arlington was an old and simple ship. While she was strong and dependable, her rudimentary design made her vulnerable. It wouldn't take much to send her to the bottom of Lake Superior. With this in mind, Maxie felt that it was critical to inspect her hatches. He ordered a change in the ship's course to offer protection so second mate Ferris could go out and ensure their security. But as they heaved and rolled, Captain Burke stormed into the pilot house and angrily ordered them to resume their original course. Then, just as abruptly, he returned to his cabin, mumbling on his way out that they would never get any place going in the wrong direction. His crew reluctantly complied, steering back into the storm before any inspection could be made. As the early morning hours passed, wave after wave smashed over her deck, some reaching as high as 10 feet over her midships. By 3:30, Maxie was sure that the hatch covers had sustained critical damage. Brief moments that the water cleared away, he could see several places where tarpaulins had been torn and strongbacks were bent or missing. The ship was taking on water, and Maxie knew that they were about to cross the point of no return. He called down to Captain Burke's cabin to summon him to the pilot house. In these conditions, it was insane that the ship's master wasn't in command. With no reply, Maxie went down himself and banged on the captain's door. He needed him to take command so that he could organize a crew to repair the damaged hatches. He heard the man grumble and stir, but received no clear reply. Frustrated, Maxie returned to the pilot house. By now, the number 5 hatch was almost completely uncovered, and the ship had developed a 5-degree list to port. Soon, Captain Burke lurched once again into the pilot house. Maxie told him that the ship was going down. Burke barely acknowledged the dire warning, but he ordered the ship turned toward the north shore. The order came far too late to save the Arlington. Sometime just before 4:30 a.m., Chief Engineer Fred Gilbert was awoken by Second Engineer Lester Wood, who was on duty at the time. Gilbert immediately realized that the ship was listing. Wood gave him an alarming update. Water was flooding into the ship's holds. Cracking sounds suggested that the ship's wheat cargo had gotten wet and was expanding, putting even more pressure on the ship's bulkheads. And rivets were popping nearly everywhere. Gilbert raced to assess the situation himself. He found the ship's ash pits filling with water, and the bulkheads that separated the fire hole from the number 2 cargo hold was bulging and clearly near failure. The experienced engineer knew what this all meant. The ship was dying, and there was nothing they could do at this point to save her. Gilbert sprang into action. He told Woods what was happening and then raced topside, where he grabbed the ship's whistle cord and let out 5 short blasts to alert the crew. He then returned below to make sure all his men made it topside. Even before the warning, most of the Arlington's crew knew that they were in danger. Men raced down to the crew quarters to rouse anyone still sleeping, as Gilbert led the engine crews to the lifeboats. By now the list had increased to 30 degrees, rendering one of the 2 lifeboats useless. Gilbert ordered the second lifeboat prepared. Meanwhile, in the pilot house, Captain Burke barely responded to the unfolding catastrophe. Maxie took matters into his own hands. He ran to the ship's horn and let off a distress signal. 7 short blasts, followed by 4 long ones. As he and the other men raced aft, the ship's wireless operator, William Lee, asked Captain Burke if he should send a distress signal, but the captain simply nodded to the pilot house windows. Lee looked up to see the lights of the Collingwood, only around 250 yards away. By then it was obvious to Captain Carson that the Arlington was in distress. They were close enough to see the increasingly obvious list and hear the 2 separate distress calls. He sailed as close as he could and readied his men to rescue the crew of the foundering ship. Wheelsman Elmer Callum was the last to leave the pilot house. Loyal to his post, he had remained at the ship's wheel as long as he could. But when it was painfully clear that the Arlington was all but gone, he finally abandoned his post. As he left the pilot house, he turned to Captain Burke, expecting him to join him. But Tatey Bug Burke stood silent. Callum raced aft to join the rest of the crew in abandoning the ship. He told them the captain wasn't coming, and with that, the crew of the Arlington set away in the lifeboat and watched quietly as their ship settled into the water before rolling over onto her port side and slipping beneath the waves. It's said that Captain Burke remained in the pilot house. He sadly waved goodbye to his crew as his ship plunged to the depths of Lake Superior. The Collingwood's logbook recorded that the Arlington went down at 5:15 a.m. on May 1st, 1940. Her crew was picked up 15 minutes later. With all but Captain Burke accounted for, Captain Carson sailed for the Sioux Locks. His ship lacked wireless equipment, so it wasn't until they arrived at the locks that word of the tragedy reached the outside world. When they arrived in the Arlington's home port of Midland, Ontario, they were greeted by a crowd of around 700 friends, family members, and onlookers. While there was great relief that the Arlington's crew made it home safely, no one could explain Captain Burke's actions that night. Investigators found no reason to believe that there were any faults with the Arlington that left her crew especially vulnerable. It was found that her owners, Captain Burke's brothers, had invested considerably to improve the ship while she was under their ownership. Likewise, the inquiry found little reason to doubt Captain Burke's abilities leading up to that fateful voyage. It was clear that the Arlington should have followed a course along the protected North Shore, or found a place to wait out the storm safely. Taking her into the middle of the lake during such conditions was a death sentence. While officials took care not to come down too harshly on the deceased captain, it was clear that it was his actions alone, or lack of action, that ultimately doomed the Arlington. No one could quite explain his strange behavior leading up to the tragedy, or his refusal to leave his ship, even when it was clear that it was doomed. Some speculated that Captain Burke was following the age-old tradition of the captain going down with his ship, but most felt that this was a silly idea. No captain on the Great Lakes had voluntarily gone down with his ship since Captain William Morris of the William F. Sauber in 1903. Further contradicting this theory was Captain Burke's own actions 16 years prior when another ship under his command, the Glenorchy, collided with another freighter in thick fog and sank in under 6 minutes. Throughout that previous incident, Captain Burke acted heroically, even risking his own life to save a wheelsman trapped in his berth by the collision. A subsequent inquiry found that Burke was not at fault for the accident or another incident early in his career when a fire took down a lumber barge under his command. Others believe that Captain Burke was suffering from some unknown illness. But it's likely that we'll never know what was really going on with Tatey Bug Burke that night. The investigation found that on May 1st, 1940, Chief Engineer Gilbert, Second Engineer Woods, and First Mate Maxey, as well as the crew of the Collingwood, all acted heroically. As for Captain Burke, his actions that night remain a mystery, and the Arlington quickly faded from memory, becoming just another ship lost to the gales of Lake Superior. But then in 2023, a Negaunee, Michigan resident reported a potential target near Copper Harbor on Lake Superior to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. The target led the organization to discover the wreck of the Arlington around 35 miles north of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula. The discovery, announced only a few days ago, offers an incredible look at the over 110-year-old vessel, frozen in time in the depths of Lake Superior, right where her master guided her. But his state of mind that night will forever remain a mystery. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and channel members who got to see this video early and ad-free. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Till the next one, be nice to people.